Hello and welcome to our event, Breaking Down the Building Blocks of Endless War, Opportunities and Obstacles in 2022 and Beyond. My name is Sarah Higdusti, the Executive Director of Win Without War, and I'm so happy to be speaking with you today with support from Friends Committee on National Legislation, Afghans for a Better Tomorrow, Demand Progress, Daily Kos, and MPower Change. The protests against the war in Iraq were one of the very first marches I ever participated in. And I'm sure many of you who are watching these calls were joined in those protest movements as well. It's hard to believe it's been 20 years and since Congress passed the law that authorized the invasion of Iraq, and 21 years since the war in Afghanistan. And while it's been 2 decades, it's critical that we do not forget the harm that is continuing to be done as a result of those decisions. Declaring war is meant to be the business of Congress because they are the closest to the people. Yet in 2002 and 2001, authorizations for the use of military force, also known as the AUMFs, took that power, gave it very little guardrails, and handed the power back to the presidency. As a result, these laws have turned into deadly loopholes that presidents in various administrations have taken advantage of to justify operations in over 20 countries, including, like in 2020, a strike on an Iranian general that almost brought us to the brink of a devastating all-out war. This really isn't hard. Laws that make it easy to go to war, that take away checks and balances between Congress and the president, are ones that put us all at risk and shouldn't be on the books. That's why I'm so incredibly grateful to be joined today by our phenomenal panel, as well as Congresswoman Barbara Lee. Congresswoman Lee has been a champion of foreign policy that centers people for the entirety of her career, and 20 years ago opposed the Iraq AUMF and was the only member of Congress not to vote for the war in Afghanistan. And while back then she faced threats, her decisions now are seen for the bold visionary moves that they were. Thank you so much for being here, Congresswoman.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm really happy to be with you and Win Without War and all of our phenomenal panelists and organizations and everyone who really have been such powerful allies to help us get to where we are today. It's unfortunate that we've had to go 20, 21 years in this fight to repeal these authorizations that should have never happened. But thank you all very much. And we're going to win, and we're going to win without war. So look forward to this discussion.
Absolutely. So my first question for you, Congresswoman, is 20 years ago, this past Sunday, President Bush signed the 2002 authorization for the use of military force, giving the legal green light for the invasion of Iraq, which was a disastrous decision. Why, after 20 years, do you think we have the opportunity to repeal that law and win now?
Well, we have that opportunity in many ways because of all of you. And this has been, I've introduced the repeal of both 2001, 2002 for years and years and years. And for the most part, I've gotten them through the House of Representatives in a variety of ways, and an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Bill or freestanding, and then we get stuck in the Senate. The president, when I was getting the 2002 off of the floor this year, issued a statement of administrative policy that he would sign the repeal of the 2002 into law once it gets to his desk. And so what can I say? We're close. Now we're in the Senate with Senator Kaine working, and we've got to find 10 Republicans and working on that. And hopefully with your activism and what you all have done over so many years will continue until we get this done. But let me just say one thing about that 2002 authorization. It was based on lies. It should have never happened. I was on the Foreign Affairs Committee then, and I knew, and many members knew, that there were no weapons of mass destruction. And people forget this, in Iraq. And that was the drumbeat, that we had to destroy the weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein was hiding. And so the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, was conducting the inspections. And fast forward to what happened is the authorization came to the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I said, no, let the inspectors complete their investigations. Well, I took my amendment, it didn't pass the committee, so I took it to rules, got a rule, it came to the floor, and my amendment, all it said was, okay, let's just hold up, let the inspections be completed, and then we'll come back to the drawing board. Well, I got 72 votes. I'll never forget that. 72 votes for that amendment only. But had we voted for that, again, we wouldn't have done this, because it was clear when the IAEA completed their investigation, there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So whatever lies people are telling now about that is just not true. It was based on weapons of mass destruction, which were not there. And many members of Congress knew that. And so when the vote to vote on it, I believe we had 130 votes, because more members had learned since the 2001 not to give any president the authority to wage war for whatever reason in perpetuity.
I think that's such an important point, that that authorization was based on lies that I think can often be forgotten and is so important to center. And again, we are so close to winning on this one, and that extra effort is going to make all the difference. And I'm really glad that, Congresswoman, you brought up your own leadership and the way you've been such a consistent champion on these issues. The next question I have for you is, you were the only member of Congress to vote against the war in Afghanistan. What do you think gave you such clarity and courage in the face of such clear failure from the rest of Congress?
Well, Sarah, it was clear to me, and believe you me, I was sitting in the Capitol, had to evacuate, just to put it in context of personally. And my chief of staff's cousin was a flight attendant on Flight 93. And those heroes and sheroes took that plane down to keep it from coming into the Capitol. So for me, I was as angry, as anxious, and as determined as anyone to bring terrorists to justice. I mean, come on, over 3,000 people were killed. And look at so many people still who have long-term health issues as a result of that. And so I wasn't looking at the world through rose-colored glasses, but I knew 3 days after a horrific attack, you do not make hard decisions about war or strategies to address terrorism or whatever. I'm a psych major, psychiatric social work. I have my MSW, and that first thing you learn in psychology 101 is you don't make hard decisions when you're in mourning, when you're afraid, when you're anxious, when you're angry. You just don't do that. And it was, for the life of me, that was the first thing I said, why in the world are we doing this right now? People need to grieve. We need to plan. We need to determine a rational, appropriate response. No one listened. So we got the authorization with 60 words, and you can read it. It said, in essence, any president can use force forever, period, ... I said, what is this? My dad was in the military 25 years. I know what going to war means. He was in World War II and Korea. So you don't send our troops in harm's way. You don't engage in military options, can always be on the table. Let us look at what we need to do in terms of a response. And no one would listen. I spoke out. And believe you me, though, several members of Congress spoke out and agreed with me. But what happened was, when it came to the vote, and I don't blame anybody, because the moment was emotional. It was terrible. And for me personally, there's no way I can give away the people's power, be it the Constitution, to any president ever. And that's what this authorization did. It just said any president, anytime, anywhere. And it said, as long as there's a connection to 9/11. Well, come on, we know it's been used over and over and over again for military attacks, for assassination attempts, not connection anywhere near to 9/11. And so we've lost so many of our troops. So many have PSD, so many are injured, so many families destroyed, so many people from Afghanistan, their lives were shattered, refugees, children. I mean, so we can't even only, think about the losses of the United States. We have to think about the losses of people in the region and how their lives were shattered as a result of this. And so, yeah, I'm going to keep trying to repeal that. And we're going to get there. It's a little more difficult than 2002. But that moment, it was hard for me because, it was politically difficult. Everyone told me more than likely I would lose my election. Okay. Everyone told me I'd probably get death threats and maybe get killed. and you should see all the vicious attacks that came after me. I mean, security for months. At my alma mater, Mills College, we have 60,000 emails, letters, and contacts to my office. About 50% of them are horrible, coming after me, calling me a traitor. My opponent then walked in the Veterans Day parade in New York City with Rudy Giuliani, carrying a sign, you got to see this, with a picture of me smiling, the World Trade Towers burning in the background, saying Barbara Lee hates America. And they were at the front of that line in that march in New York. So for me, it was terrible. It was awful. But, you know, I have to stand my ground. Everyone has to stand their ground when they believe in the values and the Constitution and whatever else you believe in, if you think you're on the right side of history and doing the right thing.
Absolutely. And thank you for being such a clear role model for that, for doing the right thing, even when it is hard and even when it is challenging. And again, it has been 20 years and we have seen the results and the untold harm that has come from those decisions. And I will just say, for personally, you have always been such a fantastic role model in this space and are so grateful for your leadership. Now, taking us to the next question. As you said, we are going to win. And my question for you is, what's next after we do win this and repeal the 2002 AUMF? Where are the opportunities to work with the Biden administration and others in Congress to knock out the legal underpinnings of endless war? And where do our allies sometimes need a bit of a push?
Yeah, and I think, well, we go to 2001 and we're working on that now because that's a little more difficult. So we have to have all hands on deck right now in 2002, all hands on deck on 2001. But then the Biden administration, nobody reads the Democratic Party platform, but I would encourage you to read that because I was a drafter of that platform. There were only 15 of us. And in that platform, we laid out a framework to stop these forever wars and to reassert Congress's role, constitutional responsibilities in the declaration or the authorization of force. So I believe that President Biden gets it. I believe the Biden administration does, but we have to make sure we hold any administration accountable. That's what democracy is all about. And so we have to be very vigilant and we have to make sure, and again, I encourage you to read that Democratic Party platform. Like I say, nobody reads it, but I do, because I hold people's feet to the fire when I say, oh, no, just on digressing on cannabis, on a lot of issues that we care about. I was able to negotiate with the Bernie people and the Biden people to get a fairly progressive platform. And this is in the platform. So I would urge you to look at it and read it so you know kind of the direction that the Biden administration is going in. It may not be everything we want, but I can tell you one thing. I know that they're committed to end the forever wars and to try to develop a framework to reassert Congress's constitutional job responsibilities, because we've been missing in action.
Brilliant. My last question for you, Congresswoman, is after we finish this, after our expert panels have a chance to speak, and we have people from all around the country on this webinar right now, we're going to ask people to call through to their members of representatives. And as someone who often gets those calls, will you share a little bit on what the impact is when everyday people reach out to their members of their representatives, asking them to make change?
Well, first of all, this is what democracy is all about. You just don't elect representatives and leave them alone. You elect representatives to hold them accountable to their commitment, their promises, and what they need to do, right? In terms of public service and in terms of accountability. So I get a lot of calls and what you're doing, emails, calls, texting, what you're doing is holding your members of Congress accountable, and it should come from the grassroots. It comes from you, it comes from voters. Don't forget, November's coming up. You have to remind elected officials, my vote counts. And this is really a lesson in democracy in action. And that's what we got to do. So many think that just voting ends it. Voting is just the beginning. And so what you all are doing is you mount these campaigns, understand that these elected officials will listen, they'll read, and make sure it comes from their districts and their voters. And they have to be responsive and accountable. And that's the way it works, or it's supposed to work.
Amazing. I love that. Yes, it is up to us to hold our elected officials accountable. And one of the best ways we can do that is build those relationships one phone call at a time. Amazing. Thank you so much, Congresswoman, for taking the time to be with us today and for all your leadership over the years. It has been phenomenal to be able to have this chance to talk to you. And again, thank you for all that you have done.
No, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Win Without War, and to all of our panelists and all of our organizations and all of you, because you're keeping it going on. You're helping me. I couldn't do any of this without you over the last 20, 21 years. Trust me. And so it's an honor to be with you and look forward to winning. So take care. And don't forget election, vote, vote, vote.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Okay, bye-bye.
And now I'd like to turn things over to Eric Ackenberry, Win Without War's Government Relations Director, to lead our expert and activist panel discussion. Over to you, Eric.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and it's a pleasure to be with everyone today. I can't really top that, but I will try to build on it by just reflecting a bit and saying in early 2021, many of us were really hopeful that a new Congress and the Biden administration would tear down the pillars supporting our endless wars. And certainly many in Congress had drawn up plans to do so. Now, there has been significant change, including the president breaking with an untenable status quo and withdrawing US forces from Afghanistan. But the first 2 years of the Biden administration also show the limits of what any president may be willing to give up in terms of the war-making powers they've slowly taken from Congress decade by decade. And alongside some real change, there have been false starts towards reform, as well as an unwillingness with regards to Afghans and others to make whole those communities that our wars have so damaged. We again find ourselves pressing Congress to address these challenges by taking back powers that no president is going to give up freely. So to talk us through this tricky moment, where steps forward have been taken, but there's so much left to do, and to fire us up about real victories we can win in the near term, I'm thrilled to welcome Hina Shamsi, Director of the ACLU's National Security Project, Heather Brandon Smith, Legislative Director for the Friends Committee on National Legislation's Militarism and Human Rights Program, and Arash Azizada, co-founder of Afghans for a Better Tomorrow. And I'd like to remind you in the audience, and I see some of you already making good use of it, we're taking questions. So as you hear something that excites you, or maybe something you want to know more about, please send a question about it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We won't get to everybody's question, but we will be able to incorporate some as we go along with the panel. And I see all of my panelists are up, and I'm excited to speak to them all. I'm going to start with Hina Shamsi. I'm going to start with you first. At the American Civil Liberties Union, you're tracking unlawful uses of force as closely as anyone. To what extent have our endless wars pushed ahead since President Biden assumed office?
Thanks so much, Eric. Thanks so much, Win Without War, and to all my fellow panelists. I'm so delighted to be here with you, even as we're talking about such incredibly important and consequential things. And I hope you'll forgive me if I just start with saying what an incredible honor it is to hear from Representative Lee. I remember digging up and watching her speech in 2001, and at a time when I felt as a young person terrified and alone in thinking, what is this country about to do? And her courage was and very much continues to be an inspiration. I'm going to begin with a bit of bad news, if I may. Just a couple of weeks ago on a Friday afternoon, news broke in the New York Times that President Biden had authorized new secret rules authorizing the use of lethal force outside recognized war zones. Now, the Times headline, for those of us who read it, made it sound like a good thing. It said, White House tightens rules on counterterrorism drone strikes. That's because President Biden's secret rules are reportedly tighter than the ones that came before him, President Trump's rules. And sure, tighter rules for American lethal force are better than looser rules. But this misses the forest for the trees. You see, unfortunately, after promising to end forever wars and raising all our hopes, with this new policy, President Biden doubled down on a program that will only entrench them. And I say this as someone who, you're right, we've been following this very, very closely for 20 years. And like the rest of us here, we're nonpartisan in our approach to this. And it's really important to call out when leaders of both parties do things that are inconsistent with our system of checks and balances and the rule of law. And unfortunately, President Biden is continuing this approach of successive presidents since 2002, because this lethal strikes program is a stark example of what's now a structural failure in our system of checks and balances. And Sarah was referring to this a little bit earlier. But, you know, it's been far easier for our country to use lethal force and get into wars than to responsibly end them. And I want to reflect a little bit about structural checks and balances, just as getting us into a context of why this is so critically important. And, you know, state the obvious, the Constitution vests only in Congress the power to declare war and to authorize force, because that decision is so incredibly consequential for lives, for liberty and rights. And the decision to go to war vests extraordinary powers in the president, like lethal force that we've been talking about, or military detention, which can result in wartime curtailment of fundamental civil rights and liberties. In other words, when the country is at war, the president can claim the authority to take actions that are unconstitutional and illegal in a normal peacetime state. And so these must be exceptional powers, right? They've got to be informed by public debate and a congressional vote to ensure that the life and death decisions are sound and democratically accountable to the people in whose names these momentous actions are taking place. But our system has broken when it comes to matters of war and peace, because successive presidents have wrongly grabbed power and Congress has wrongly ceded it. That is how, in multiple countries around the world, presidents of both parties have unilaterally authorized strikes under a program that began in 2002 in Yemen, moved on over the years to Pakistan, Somalia, Niger, and elsewhere, and invokes secretive and permissive war-based rules to kill people who are called terrorism suspects in places where we weren't or aren't at war. And presidents started by claiming commander-in-chief power under the Constitution and also the 2001 AUMF, and at various different times invoked the 2002 AUMF too, far beyond what Congress ever intended in passing either of those statutes. And they crossed the lines between wartime and peacetime powers that are essential to the rule of law, democratic accountability, and the right to life. And despite widespread, credible accounts of horrifying civilian deaths of mainly brown and Black people in majority Muslim countries, the executive branch has kept expanding the program and the categories of groups and people who could be targeted. You know, if any other country were doing this, we would rightly call it unlawful extrajudicial killing, and we cannot let it become entrenched or normalized. So what we and so many others had hoped for is for President Biden, Congress to set this country on a rights-promoting path, right? By ending reliance on militarized use of force, investing in lawful intelligence gathering, peace building, diplomacy, and other tools that experts tell us is a more effective way of addressing conflict and violence abroad. And so I'm really glad that we're here talking today about the need to roll back presidential power and the ways in which Congress can do that, and recognize that, you know, this is not just a story that's 20 years old. This is something for our generation. This is our generational fight to do this. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for that wonderful overview of a very serious topic. And I like how you put it, you ended on the term of the generational fight. and how that fight unfolds for us. And I want to turn now to Heather, who her and her colleagues at the Friends Committee on National Legislation, along with others, have been leading part of that, a key part of that generational fight for a while now, which is an effort to roll back the 2002 AUMF. Heather, if I can turn to you, we've heard folks talk a couple of times now already on the call about the 2002 AUMF, but can you walk us through exactly what it authorizes and exactly how it's been interpreted over the years?
Yes, no, absolutely. Thank you so much, Eric. And thank you, Women Without War, and to my fellow panelists, thank you. And I just want to echo Hina's thanks for having Representative Barbara Lee here to speak to us. She is truly the leader in the effort to end forever war. And we would never be so close to repealing the 2002 AUMF without her persistent efforts over more than 2 decades. So, plainly speaking, the 2002 AUMF, this is the law that authorized the Iraq War. It's also referred to as the Iraq AUMF or the 2002 Iraq AUMF. And as I mentioned, we have a very real opportunity to now repeal this law, and I'll get into that a little bit later. So to answer the question about exactly what it is and what it authorizes, there is an enormous discrepancy between what Congress actually authorized and what the executive branch claims the 2002 AUMF authorizes. And that, in a nutshell, is why it's so important to repeal it. So I want to take you through, though, a bit of a brief history of the law and to explain how we got here, how expansive it has become. So in October 2002, Congress passed the 2002 AUMF to, and I quote, defend U.S. national security against the continuing threat posed by Iraq and to enforce all relevant Security Council resolutions regarding Iraq. Now, this reference to Security Council resolutions, this was about weapons of mass destruction. Representative Barbara Lee mentioned this earlier. The George W. Bush administration claimed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction or was developing weapons of mass destruction, and that these weapons posed a threat to the United States. Now, as we all learned, this claim was false. There were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. But in the meantime, we invaded. Saddam Hussein was overthrown and the Iraq war continued. So fast forward to December 2011, President Obama removed all US troops from Iraq and officially declared the Iraq war over. So you'd think that at this point, the 2002 Iraq AUMF would have become obsolete. The conflict that it authorizes over, all US troops were back home, this chapter was closed. But that's not what happened. So much like with the 2001 AUMF that we've also discussed, successive presidential administrations have continued to interpret the 2002 Iraq AUMF far beyond what Congress intended. Now, this first really happened in 2014. This is when the Obama administration sent US troops back into Iraq to fight ISIS. And they said that the 2002 Iraq AUMF provided additional authority for this fight. Then they went on to say that it also authorized fighting ISIS in Syria and elsewhere. The Trump administration took this from the Obama administration and they went even further. They said the 2002 Iraq AUMF wasn't even limited to operations against ISIS. They said it could be used against any entity that threatened Iraq. So this could be a non-state group like ISIS, or it could be even another country. And then that's what we saw play out. So in January 2020, the Trump administration conducted a lethal strike that killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani and 9 others. And the administration claimed that the 2002 Iraq AUMF, this 18-year-old law, authorized this strike against Iran. It's really hard to overemphasize the consequences that could have flown from this action. We had attacked a high-ranking general from another country. They could have attacked the US homeland. We were really at the brink of an all-out war with Iran. What did happen was Iran attacked a base in Iraq that housed US soldiers, and over 100 US troops suffered traumatic brain injury as a result of that attack. Now, it seems inappropriate to use the word lucky right here to describe this, but in a sense, we were lucky that things didn't go further, but we might not be so lucky in the future. And that is why it is so important to repeal the 2002 Iraq AUMF, to get it off the books so it can't be abused again. And we're now in a position to finally make this happen. There is strong bipartisan support for repealing the 2002 Iraq AUMF in both the House and the Senate. There are 11 Republican co-sponsors of a Senate bill to repeal the 2002 AUMF. So that's enough to overcome a filibuster. And what's more, the White House has even come out in support of this repeal. President Biden issued a statement of administration policy, which says that the 2002 Iraq AUMF isn't needed for any current operations and that it should be repealed. So here's the opportunity. This year, the House included Representative Barbara Lee's amendment to repeal the 2002 AUMF in its annual defense policy bill, the National Defense Authorization Act. And now, Senators Tim Kaine and Todd Young have filed a bipartisan amendment to repeal the 2002 Iraq AUMF in the Senate version of the National Defense Authorization Act. But 900 amendments have been filed to this Senate bill, and not all of them are going to receive a vote. So that's where we need your help. We need you to help by contacting your senators to make sure that the Kaine-Young amendment to repeal the 2002 Iraq AUMF receives a vote on the Senate floor. So I want to thank you all for having me, and I hope that you're able to take action to finally get this outdated and dangerous authorization off the books.
Thank you so much, Heather. That won't be the last time we hear from you. But I want to make right now a sort of hard but an important pivot to another issue, which is Heather was just discussing how we can legally end an endless war by repealing the 2002 AUMF. But we also have other obligations. When an endless war ends, what happens to the people that we leave behind? And that's what I want to turn to talk to Arash Azizadeh about. Arash, co-founder of an organization called Afghans for a Better Tomorrow. It's been over a year since US forces withdrew from Afghanistan. What is happening after the end of that war? And what responsibilities do the US government and people in the United States still have towards Afghans?
Thank you, Eric, and thank you to Win Without War and Sarah and a wonderful panelist, and obviously Congresswoman Lee as well. I sit in front of you as an Afghan American and as a product of displacement. My parents fled in the 1980s, partially also due to Americans' involvement in war in Afghanistan. And for Afghans, endless war has been quite costly. While the occupation lasts for 20 years, American involvement in Afghanistan precedes that by roughly 20 or 25 years, when America took covert action in the 1970s. And so this lasting American foreign policy in Afghanistan has been quite costly. I first heard about Congresswoman Lee when I was in the 8th grade, when the 9/11 attacks happened. My family moved to the United States in August of 2001. And I knew that the attacks of 9/11 would rock my world as both an Afghan and a Muslim American. And the US soon invaded Afghanistan, and here we are 20 years later. Unfortunately, the US aligned itself with notorious human rights violators and fueled endemic corruption, both which led indirectly to the rise of the Taliban. And so what we see in Afghanistan today is a rather unfortunate situation where conflict has not ended, and the US has taken itself out of the conflict, but the misery and pain of suffering of Afghan kind of continues. And this happens in most big cities in Afghanistan, as well as small rural villages. Girls cannot go to school, women cannot take part in public life. Brave women rights activists are jailed, imprisoned, and tortured. Different historically marginalized ethnic and religious communities, such as Sikhs and Hazaras, are murdered and ethnically displaced. And the starvation that happens throughout Afghanistan is increasing, with a really harsh winter coming up yet again. And the United States is partially responsible for the starvation and the fact that Afghanistan remains on the brink of famine, The United States is continuing to deeply sanction the country, which is punishing an already deeply poor country in the first place. And the United States continues to freeze assets that belong to the Afghan people. They don't belong to the United States, the Taliban, or anyone else. They belong to the Afghan people. And so for Afghans, this pain and conflict really continues. And we have been happy enough, while this deeply tragic and painful, we've been happy to welcome 80,000 new community members, and they are here for really sad and tragic reasons, but they're here in America now. And so as Afghan American progressive, we seek reparations and justice, not just for the past 20 years, but for America's continued involvement in Afghanistan for many decades, something that precedes me and my life here in the United States. And I think that starts with the unfreezing of assets and for the United States to move away from its policy of trying to just decimate and destroy the Afghan economy, which continues to this day. But I'm honored and blessed enough to work with many new community members who are here in Los Angeles, but they are in every corner and every crevice in every big city here in America. They are in 49 states plus Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, America's obligation with them doesn't end, because these folks here are only here with temporary protections. They have a really hard path to permanent status and legal residency and eventual U.S. citizenship. And so while they are starting to become part of their communities here in Los Angeles and Washington, D.C., in probably small towns where many of the people who are attending this webinar are attending, I can assure you there's a new Afghan refugee within your vicinity. However, these folks don't have an easy pathway to legal status. And as in the community, we spent the past few months focusing on the Afghan Adjustment Act. The Afghan Adjustment Act would alleviate this. It would give them a cost-free and easy path to legal status. Afghans came to the United States in a very chaotic and unprepared withdrawal that left, unfortunately, many behind. Many of these folks stood alongside the United States mission for 20 years. They translated for the U.S. Army. They worked for organizations and entities that were supported by USAID. They believed in America's mission, but most importantly, they stood alongside the United States. And Afghan Adjustment Act is, I think, just like the repeal of the AUMF, is something that both parties are interested in. It's a bipartisan piece of legislation currently in front of Congress. And so we are hopeful that America keeps its promise, upholds its word, and passes the Afghan Adjustment Act. And just to quickly mention too, the United States has obviously been involved militarily throughout the world in places beyond, aside of Afghanistan, in Vietnam, in Korea. It's done this type of adjustment, a large-scale adjustment status for other refugee and immigrant populations before. It has done so for the Cubans and the Vietnamese. It's done so for the Iraqis. And so this just merely follows historic precedent. And so when we talk about war and ending wars, that obligation does not end the minute an American soldier leaves Afghanistan or any other country. That obligation really continues on, and especially impacts this new refugee population that is entering America when housing prices are through the roof, when inflation is hurting most everyday Americans. And just as these Afghan refugees are new community members, are trying to be part of the American fabric. And I'll just quickly share that these folks are calling me and emailing us and asking us, how do I get a green card? How do I ensure that I have permanent protections as I try to do all these other things? I'm sending my kids to school, I'm learning English, I'm finding a job, and usually these are ride sharing service jobs. And they're asking me, will America keep its promise? Will I have a pathway to legal status? And to that I say, there's legislation that we worked on in front of Congress, and those who believe in ending endless wars can help us out by advocating to their congresspeople, to their senators to say, let's do the right thing. Let's keep our promise to our Afghan friends. Let's welcome them here with dignity, and let's pass the Afghan Adjustment Act.
Thank you so much, Arash. That's not the last we're going to hear about that today. Thank you to all my panelists for your experiences, your tremendous expertise in what you're bringing to this discussion. We're going to commence a Q&A session. I'm going to take a little bit of moderator privilege. I have a question lined up for each of the panelists based on their initial remarks. And then we will turn into some audience questions. And I have seen some really good questions come over the line. But Hina, I want to go back to you. As a candidate, President Biden promised to end the forever wars. And you gave a really good overview about what has sort of stayed, unfortunately, more continuous from administration to administration. Can you outline some positive steps you've seen the Biden administration take in the direction of ending endless war? And as importantly, or more importantly, what on the outside, what steps can we take to make sure that this progress continues?
So let me name one positive thing that I think is pretty significant. It's something that rights groups, impacted communities had wanted for a very long time, which is a new policy on civilian harm. And there's some real improvements there to, devote attention at the highest levels of the Defense Department on down, and it's really important that it comes from the top, to implement lessons learned as people go forward. And that is a very good thing. It is not enough. And there's a list of things that I want to point us to and things that we can do to push forward. So one, this new policy and the lessons learned currently does not require the Defense Department to look backwards and learn lessons from wrongful strikes, deaths, lack of accountability. And I'm talking here about basic things like amends, right? Paying actual money to people who are left with family members lost, injured, material loss. And so getting the administration, successive administrations, to apply the lessons learned over the last 20 years seems like a very fundamental thing to do. And fortunately, there is legislation in the National Defense Authorization Act that would in fact require just that and would require additional reporting. And that is super important. We've seen some real steps backwards in transparency from the Biden administration. The fact that this new lethal strikes policy is not public is a travesty. It became public thanks to litigation by the ACLU and the New York Times under the Obama administration and the Trump administration. It was redacted in some parts. We haven't heard any harm that came from that. And in any event, when our government kills in our name, we should know what the rules are. And the people impacted should know for wrongful deaths and injuries where to go. So that policy needs to be made public. We need to look backwards to account for lessons learned. Every year, Congress has appropriated $3 million. I will footnote that I think that is a paltry sum compared to other spending as compensation for victims of wrongful of strikes. That money, to our knowledge, has never been adequately paid. It needs to be paid, needs to start being paid. And then I think in the longer term, there is fortunately legislation in both houses that this president could support that actually resets the checks and balances and returns war powers and strengthens war power accountability. And returns power to Congress where it should belong and takes power away from the president, which is really what in the longer term is going to be able to restore this country to where it needs to be on matters of war and peace structurally as a matter of constitution and law.
Looking for the unmute button. Thank you so much, Hina, and thank you again for that intervention. want to turn to Heather to follow up on a point you made. You sort of ended your talk, Heather, with a very stirring sort of push that there's a vote that could come up in the Senate as soon as November. People need to be on top of it. People need to be making it happen. What happens? The Senate's very fickle. We advocate to the Senate, many organizations. The Senate avoids taking on issues frequently that it should take up that are highly, highly important. So what happens if come November, there's no vote on repealing the O2 AUMF, despite a lot of concerted effort because of internal politics that we can't always see?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Eric. And there are really two options. I'm going to talk about the NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act option first. So as I mentioned, there is a bipartisan amendment to repeal the 2002 Iraq AUMF from Senators Tim Kaine and Todd Young, which we want to get a vote on the Senate floor. If that vote does not happen, and the Senate version of the National Defense Authorization Act doesn't include that provision, well, we still have the House version that does include that provision. And then what's going to happen is that the Senate and the House are going to come together, and in a process called conference, they're going to negotiate between the House version and the Senate version. Now, this time we have the White House supporting this repeal as well. So that's the strongest position that we've ever been when it comes to repealing the 2002 AUMF. So it would be a really great opportunity to continue to push to retain the provision in the House NDAA in the final version that is sent to the president's desk. And, frankly, even if the Senate version does get that provision in there to repeal the 2002 AUMF, that is a push that constituents should still continue to make to ensure that it is retained in the final version. All sorts of horse trading happens with these negotiations. We need to make sure that the 2002 AUMF repeal provision is not traded away for some other priority. The other potential option is that we still have this standalone bill from Senators Tim Kaine and Todd Young that I mentioned before has 11 Republican co-sponsors. The total number of co-sponsors is 51. Senator Schumer, Majority Leader Schumer, last year actually promised Senator Tim Kaine a vote on the Senate floor on repeal of the 2002 AUMF. So whether that happens as part of the National Defense Authorization Act or not, it can still happen with that standalone bill. So that is another option to push to ensure that we can get that vote happening on the Senate floor.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Heather, for telling us what the backstop is, because you always have to push twice or three times. So thank you so much. Arash, I want to turn back to you, and I want to piece out a couple of things you said in your opening remarks. One, just to underscore the sort of very clear statement that if you are progressive and you support ending endless wars, you need to support the Afghan Adjustment Act. You need to support providing for refugees that come to the United States. You also mentioned that everybody attending this call has an Afghan refugee, an individual, or a family in their vicinity. We're talking about Congress today. We're going to talk about calling Congress. We're talking about pressuring Congress, and that's really important. But for folks who have Afghan refugees in their community and have refugees from other endless wars in their community, what are things they can do in their community today to help those refugees that don't involve Washington, D.C., that don't involve calling their member of Congress?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I think that's a great question. Like, I'm Afghan and I've been in this country for quite a while. Like, I myself didn't have to be a refugee, and for the first time in a really long time, our community was, the Afghan American community specifically was overwhelmed with this large wave of folks who came in this very sudden and chaotic withdrawal. And, when we think about war and wanting to end it, I think that's something a lot of folks can maybe agree on as progressives, as just those who believe in America's role in the world. I was driving through Vermont in August, actually, and I stopped in this random town. It was my first time in Vermont, and I needed to get some food. And I was driving down Main Street in a small town in Vermont, and I looked to my left and to my right, and all these storefronts had set signs that said welcome, but then they also said welcome in Farsi and Pashto. And I was kind of wondering, I immediately started becoming more curious. I was like, what is this? Why does this small town in Vermont have these welcome signs in my native language? This seems a little bit odd, but the small town in Vermont really was kind of the role model. Just stopped to get food and talked to some store owners, and they said, yeah, 100 Afghan refugees came to this area, to this small town and Vermont in general, and they had plastered their art across this main street in Vermont. And they had just welcomed these folks with dignity. And so when I think about what it means to welcome Afghans to this country, to be part of this fabric of this society, it means giving them space to, making them feel welcome by having, signs that say welcome, or holding community events to welcome them. I think what our community, our Afghan American community has done just have workshops, whether they are asylum workshops or on how to file for Social Security numbers, or what it means to sign up your young kids in schools. But what everybody now can do, really pragmatic, actionable tasks that folks on this call can take, is to reach out to Afghan refugees. And I promise you, they are in most states except Wyoming for some reason, but they're all throughout the United States, and they're all in search of housing. And housing is just that top line issue that keeps coming back for folks. And I'm a renter myself, but for many folks who rent the United States, what you need is a credit history. And if you just came to this country in August or September or later of last year, you don't have a credit history. So one tangible action folks can take is help folks, co-signing for their housing and helping them find housing or affordable housing in this country. In certain places that means signing up for wait lists for affordable housing. In many other parts of the country, what folks really can do is sign them up or help them research where to find the cheapest housing. And usually these are not folks that are alone. These are folks with families, with multiple children. So they're often in search of 2 or 3 bedroom apartments throughout the United States. And just the mix of high inflation, the lack of having a lack of credit history, and housing prices that are affecting all of us, I think are really pushing and teetering this new refugee community, 80,000 folks, to the edge. And my biggest concern, what keeps me up at night, is 2 things. It's, will these folks be houseless? I drive through Los Angeles, and there's a lot of houseless folks pretty much everywhere. And I wonder, will Afghans, these new Afghan refugees, our newest community members, will they join folks living on the streets? And what folks on this call can do is to help prevent that, and really does take a collective effort. And so, aside of the Afghan Adjustment Act, which is would give them permanent protection, would really take away some of the anxiety of worrying about if they will be undocumented or deported, maybe not under this administration, but the next one. The secondary, or that main top line concern is having a roof over their head. It's really for the Afghan community, this new community, it's really these 2 worries, which keeps them up at night, which keeps me up at night, and which I get phone calls and text messages and emails about every day. About what should I do? What steps can I take?
Thank you so much, Arash, for that extra context, and I think for the very practical list of things folks can take on to be good neighbors and to really support people to find some stability after coming to this country. We have time for a couple of quick audience questions, and then we're going to move to our closing session. I'm actually going to take, again, moderator's privilege and answer. I saw one pop up. What is the bill number for the Senate 2002 AUMF repeal? Heather, I hope I'm not stealing your thunder when I say it's Senate Joint Resolution 10, or SJ Res 10. And if you go to the FCNL's website or other websites, or Win Without War's website, you can find further information. Question popped up, which is a question I think a lot of us who pushed against endless wars and endless war authorities have gotten over the years, from members of Congress, from folks we talked to. What if a highly valid, urgent need to go to war happens? Does the President and the Department of Defense have to wait for Congress to approve the need for too many days, weeks, months? I'm looking particularly to Hina or Heather to see if you have a reaction or thought to that question.
Yes, and in fact, there is an answer. What should happen and what legislation that is currently in both houses would require is that the president would have the authority to use force that is necessary to, quote, repel a sudden attack or in response to the concrete, specific, and immediate threat of a sudden attack. That is core commander-in-chief authority. And if there's no time to provide Congress with the briefing necessary to inform a vote to obtain prior authorization, the president does have that authority. The thing that we have a challenge with is limiting that authority to what is truly an exigent need. And so part of what the legislation would do is that outside of these exceptional circumstances, which can be met, the president would need to come to Congress to actually seek authorization to use lethal force abroad. And it would require the president to come to Congress quickly and for Congress to act quickly so that things can be debated. It would get rid of ambiguous terms that presidents have really driven, forgive the abysmal pun, tanks through in terms of, current law that the executive branch has played fast and loose with for decades. And to prevent the kind of thing that we've seen now for 20 years, essentially what happens now under war powers is that the president can keep going unless Congress acts. And we all know how hard and challenging that can be, votes to end war, political costs. So it would flip the switch in the legislation, which is that there would be an automatic cutoff for congressional funds if Congress has not authorized the use of force to continue. And that feels very, very, sensible, but also ensures that the branch of government that is supposed to be our voice has a say. And so I'm hoping that, not this year, but as folks are looking to what's ahead, they look out for this and opportunities to let their members of Congress know how important it is to seize back power.
And if I could I completely agree with everything that Hina has said. There was one point she made that I kind of wanted to double down on, which is that if there truly is an actual or imminent attack coming to the United States, that Congress doesn't have the time to come together to authorize force, the president has inherent authority under the Constitution, under Article 2, as commander-in-chief to respond with force without Congress. Many times we see arguments made that we need to retain these AUMFs forever in case there's another threat to the United States that we haven't foreseen. For starters, that's not how AUMFs work. They are passed for very specific purposes, and the president is required to adhere to those specific purposes. But on the other side, the president does have this limited authority to respond with force if there truly is, that sort of attack on the United States or an imminent attack on the United States. And I think it's really important for members of Congress to be mindful of that if either of these AUMFs are repealed and then there is another threat or there is another attack or an imminent threat of an attack, the president is not powerless to respond.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Very well said by both of you. And thank you so much. We are coming up on the 6 o'clock hour, and I promised my panelists I'd get them home in time for dinner and other things, although it's a little earlier in LA, but Arash, still we'll treat you like you're on the East Coast for now. I have a final wrap-up question for you all, and then we're going to move to a final 5-minute segment, so I don't want folks to leave. But as a final wrap-up thought from this panel, short answer, if you were in a room right now with the Speaker of the House of Representatives and the Majority Leader of the Senate, the two of whom have tremendous influence over what does and does not get to the floor for House and Senate consideration, you have 30 seconds to tell them what is the most important action they could take right now to end endless wars or to to address the needs of those who our endless wars are threatening to leave behind. Arash, could I turn to you first?
I would say 20 years, 20 years. America spent dropping bombs and spent trillions of dollars to wage war. That war didn't end, that conflict didn't end, pain and misery continues. There's a very tangible action, Congress can take. This is why we elected you. But there's tangible actions you can take to alleviate pain and suffering, to allow folks to have a dignified life after 20 years of war. That's the least they deserve. America made a promise. Let's keep it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Arash. Heather, can I turn to you?
Sure. I would say Majority Leader Schumer, keep your promise and ensure that the amendment to repeal the 2002 AUMF to the NDAA gets a vote on the Senate floor, and then we can get rid of this authorization that should have been gone long ago, that we can get this authorization off the books. And thank you to Speaker Pelosi for putting Barbara Lee's bill to repeal the 2002 AUMF through the House floor, which passed with a really strong bipartisan vote. Please ensure that we can finally get this authorization off the books.
Thank you so much, Heather. Hina, can you close out our panel?
I would say that alongside doing what Arash and Heather have requested, because we would be in the room together, you need to please push back on this new lethal strikes policy and the lack of transparency. It is absurd that we would be reading about it in the New York Times as a report instead of it being made public. And then you need to conduct actual oversight. Pass NDAA provisions that actually allow for meaningful transparency about strikes that are ongoing so that we can hold our leaders to account. And as we go forward, it is incumbent upon you as leaders of Congress and incumbent upon President Biden, who knows the importance of the Senate given his past, to pass legislation that reins in executive power and restores power to Congress on matters of war and peace.
Thank you so much, Hina. Thank you so much, Heather, Arash. Thank you to our main panel for your wisdom, your insights, your experience, the passion you clearly bring to this work. I would not want to be a government official disagreeing with any of you and the policies you're representing today. I want to thank you so much. I do see our participants list slightly dropping, but folks, the most important part of the event is coming up. And for that, where we're going to take all of this education and all of this wisdom and all of this expertise, and we're going to turn it into very concrete action. And to that end, I want to thank our main panelists, and I actually want to invite our friend and colleague, Kayvon Karazian, policy advisor for our partners at Demand Progress, to come on board. And I would just want to stress, this is the most important part of the call. Heather, Hina, Arash, even Representative Barbara Lee, my boss, Sarah, excellent, fantastic people. But if you don't take this step now, their words will have been not in vain, but their words could have gone to better use. So Kayvon, can I ask you to come on the line and explain to our audience what the action they're going to take this evening is going to be? And I'll just give you a hint that folks should begin pulling their phones out of their pockets right now.
Thanks, Eric, and thank you to all the panelists. Very insightful as usual. I'm Kayvon Karazian with Demand Progress. And like Eric said, we've heard a lot about what needs to change and why. So I'd like to invite everyone on this call. We're going to take part in a quick action to call our senators and pushing them to vote to repeal the 2002 AUMF. Let me just share very quickly. We have a call script. Can folks see that? Great. So we have a call script right now. So I'd like to get everyone to take out their phones and dial for the Capitol switchboard operator at 202-224-3121. It has to be connected to their senior senator from their state and I'll walk you through the script really quickly. Say, hello, my name is, your name. You can say your occupation or your identity or something that connects you to this issue, and name what state, city and state you're in. And you say, you can say, please customize this too. If you have other things to say, you don't need to stick exactly to this. It's kind of the guideline. But you can say something like, this is the year to repeal 2002 authorization for use of military force against Iraq. Congress authorized the disastrous war in Iraq 20 years ago. Now Congress has a real opportunity to get the dangerous law that allowed it off the books for good. And I urge Senator, you say the senator's name, to press for a vote to repeal the 2002 AUMF before Congress closes up shop so that we can finally end this endless war. And you're going to say that, hang up, redial, and that has to be connected to your state's junior senator, and you're going to deliver the same message. So I'm going to keep this script up for folks to see. And please get out your phones and start dialing. It's really important for members of Congress to not just hear from the wonky policy folks like us, even though we do good work, you all do great work, but to hear from constituents like you, to see that enough people care to pick up the phone, call their senator, especially in issues in foreign policy where there's a general conception that the public doesn't care or vote based on these issues. So it's even more important to show that there's like an organized movement for this. And as Rep. Lee mentioned at the top of the event, it's because of pressure from grassroots folks like you that we actually have a chance to getting this repealed. So yeah, I'll keep this up right now. It should take 2 minutes.
I'll just come in, Kayvon, really quickly and say, first of all, I saw, after some light shaming, I saw the number of people leaving the webinar stabilize. And so I appreciate that. I appreciate people on the call still here, pulling out their phones and calling. Kayvon, thanks so much for walking us through the script. I will say, it should not be a surprise if you get answering machines. This was an evening webinar. It is now after hours. Still call. If you get an answering machine, leave a message. They'll still take messages. Somebody's got to come in tomorrow morning, open up the voicemail box, listen to what their constituents have said. Still make that call. And I don't think it's a bad idea either. If you call, get a voicemail box, leave your message, leave this script or something similar to it. Wake up tomorrow morning, call again. Try to get somebody in person. Keep calling until you get somebody in person. Keep getting messages. The more messages, the more persistence they get from their constituents, the more impactful this will be. Kayvon, I can turn it over to you one more time, and then we can close up shop.
Sure. And to add on to that, text a friends, text 5, 10 friends, and share the script with them. Share the number. Get as many people as possible. But yeah, we'll keep this up. Thank you very much, all the panelists, all the great work done, and especially all of you right now who are taking the time to call.
All right. I don't want there to be too much dead air. Thank you so much, Kayvon, for leaving that up. If you would like this call script, I saw somebody asking in the Q&A if they could get this, and we'll take down your email. But if you would like this call script, you can just email info@winwithoutwar.org, and we'll get you this call script if you'd feel comfortable for having this as a base for action you can take on yourself. So if you want this call script, please email us at info@winwithoutwar.org, info@winwithoutwar.org, and we will get you this call script. Kayvon, thank you so much. I think you're good to go. I think the webinar, I think the grassroots event is good to go. I want to thank you all for taking a bit over an hour to sit with us this evening, to listen to Representative Barbara Lee, to listen to our panelists, and to hang out even after all that good information and to take on this action. You'll be hearing more from our respective organizations about this issue moving forward. You'll be hearing about the Afghan Adjustment Act. You'll be hearing about a host of issues that tie into ending endless war. And for that, we really appreciate your activism, your dynamism, your support, and your attention to these issues. Because to stress what Representative Lee said at the top, they're not going to move on these controversial issues. They're not going to move on controversial issues of war and peace unless you are pushing them to move. And for that, we're extremely grateful for your attention, to all of this work. So thank you all. Have a great evening.